The swamps of Naboo did not care what you were. They swallowed sound, diffused light into green-gray murk, and pressed the smell of wet earth and decay against everything that moved through them. Insects with iridescent wings, the size of a human palm, drifted between the roots of ancient trees whose trunks disappeared into black water below and gray canopy above. The planet breathed, slowly and indifferently, around the thing that had just fallen from nowhere into its embrace. Data hit the water hard. The impact registered across 412 simultaneous diagnostic subroutines in 0.003 seconds. Hull integrity, nominal. Positronic net, stable. Sensory array, fully operational. Starfleet comm badge, unresponsive. Phaser, inert. Energy cell, registering as empty despite a full charge. Recorded 11 seconds prior to the anomaly. Tricorder, offline. The dimensional rift had taken everything technological that did not belong to him and rendered it silent. What remained was Data himself. He surfaced without drama, water streaming from his pale gold skin, yellow eyes scanning the canopy with calm, precise attention. The last coherent memory in his processing queue was the bridge of the Enterprise D. A spatial distortion on the view screen. Lieutenant Worf calling red alert. Counselor. Troy's voice cut off mid-sentence as the rift expanded and swallowed him whole. The crew would be searching. That was logical. What was less logical, and therefore more immediately demanding of analysis, was the environment surrounding him now. The vegetation bore no resemblance to any cataloged planet in Federation records. The atmospheric composition was breathable, nitrogen-oxygen, within acceptable parameters, but trace element ratios were unfamiliar. The gravitational pull was close to Earth standard, perhaps 0.94. Bioluminescent. Organisms pulsed faintly. In the root systems beneath the water's surface, Data pulled himself onto a mossy embankment and stood, water running from his uniform, and began the only rational course of action available to him. He would observe. He would gather data. He would, in the absence of all other options, proceed. He had walked approximately 1.3 kilometers through the swamp when he heard the sound. It was a cry, high-pitched, animalistic, but with the unmistakable cadence of a being attempting communication, rather than simple distress. Data altered his course without hesitation, processing the sound's direction with an accuracy no human ear could match, and emerged from a stand of thick-rooted trees into a small clearing where the ground rose above the waterline. The creature standing in the clearing was roughly 1.9 meters tall, with long flat ears hanging beside a narrow face, wide orange eyes, and skin the color of wet clay. It was bipedal, dressed in a manner suggesting a functioning civilization, and it was currently backing away from a mechanized unit that. The armored units raised their weapons. Data moved. He covered the distance in 1.1 seconds, interposing himself between the drone's weapon and the creature, taking the energy blast directly against his forearm. The impact registered as a surface-level discharge, painful by Federation standards, genuinely damaging to organic tissue, but insufficient to penetrate his duranium-laced substructure. He absorbed it, processed the energy dissipation across his chassis, and turned to face the three combat units with the same expression. He brought to chess problems and stellar cartography. Mild, focused interest. The lead drone fired again. Data stepped left, closed the distance to the unit in 2 strides, and disabled it with a single, precise application of force to the joint, connecting its weapon arm to its torso, a motion that required 340 newtons of torque, applied at the correct angle, and took him 0.4 seconds to complete. The second unit raised its weapon. Data rotated, caught the barrel, bent it perpendicular to its firing axis, and set the unit down on the ground with something that might generously be described as gentleness. The third unit attempted to run. Data let it go. He would not destroy something capable of flight simply because it had fired at him. There was information to be gathered first. He turned back to the creature, which was staring at him with enormous orange eyes and an expression he cataloged as equal parts terror and profound confusion. "You are uninjured?" Data asked. The creature blinked. It spoke a rapid, liquid language that Data's universal translator would have decoded instantly if his comm badge were functional. Without it, he heard only sound. He filed the linguistic pattern for analysis and tried a secondary approach. Open body language, no sudden movements. A slight tilt of the head that in most humanoid cultures signaled non-aggression. The creature took a step toward him, then another. Then it grabbed his arm with both hands and spoke again, urgently, gesturing toward the deeper swamp. "I do not understand your language," Data said, which he was aware was not helpful. "But I believe you are asking me to follow you." He followed. They had not gone far when Data heard something else entirely, the low electronic hum of more combat drones moving through the undergrowth, in numbers sufficient to suggest an organized sweep pattern. Whoever had deployed those units was conducting a large-scale operation across this terrain. That implied infrastructure, command structure, an opponent of meaningful organizational capacity. Data filed 17 new questions and kept walking. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The creature led him to the edge of the swamp, where the ground firmed and the trees thinned. And there, moving with the quiet, purposeful speed of people who knew they were being hunted, were two humans. One older, with long brown hair, and a calm face that held authority as naturally as atmosphere holds oxygen. One younger, with a short Padawan braid and an expression caught somewhere between alertness and barely contained tension. Both wore robes. Both carried, clipped at their belts, cylindrical metal handles that Data's pattern recognition could not immediately classify. The older one stopped. When he saw Data, his eyes moved across him with a quality of attention that felt, somehow, different from simple observation, as if he were reading something beyond the visible. Whatever he found, or failed to find, made him go very still. "That's interesting," the man said quietly, more to himself than anyone present. Data clasped his hands behind his back. "I am Commander Data," he said, "of the Federation Starship Enterprise. I appear to have been displaced from my point of origin by a spatial anomaly of unknown classification. I do not know where I am, and I would appreciate any information you are willing to provide. I am not a threat to you." The younger human's hand had moved toward his weapon handle. The older one raised two fingers, and the hand stilled. "I'm Jinn," the man said. "This is my Padawan, Obi-Wan Kenobi. And I believe you, Commander." He paused, which is the most remarkable part of all. Jinn had felt the Force speak to him in many ways across the decades of his life as a Jedi Master. It had whispered through wind-shifted leaves on Coruscant's upper levels. It had roared through him like a tide during the darkest battles of his career. It had guided his hand, stilled his mind, and on two memorable occasions, saved his life through what lesser observers would have called coincidence, and what he knew to be something far older and more deliberate than chance. Standing in the thinning tree-line of Naboo's swamp margin, looking at the pale, golden-skinned being who had just dismantled 3 battle droids with the calm efficiency of someone arranging furniture, Kagan reached for the Force as naturally as breathing, and found nothing. Not darkness, not a void in the way the dark side created voids. Those had texture, a sucking quality, like scar tissue over a wound. This was simply absence. Commander, Data existed in the Force the way a stone existed in a river, present, solid, physically undeniable, and generating no current whatsoever. The Force moved around him. It did not move through him. In 40 years of Jedi training and service, Kagan had never encountered anything like it. "You said you came from a ship," Obi-Wan said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who was suspicious, but had been trained not to show it carelessly. "We detected no vessel entering the system beyond the trade Federation blockade." "That is correct," Data said. "I did not arrive by conventional means. The anomaly that displaced me was not a vessel. It was a rupture in the fabric of space at the quantum level, what my colleagues would classify as a dimensional rift. I have no method of replicating or reversing the event with the equipment currently available to me." He paused precisely 1 second. "Which is to say, none." Obi-Wan looked at Kagan. Kagan looked at Data. "You're telling us," Obi-Wan said slowly, "that you fell through a hole between universes." "That is a simplified but not inaccurate characterization, yes." Jar Jar Binks, whose name Data had not yet learned, but whose gestural communication he was actively cataloging made a sound that conveyed, across all language barriers, something in the general territory of, "I told you this day would be strange." And no one listened. They moved while they talked. Kagan set the pace, steady and unhurried, in the way of a man who understood. That panic spent energy, better conserved for actual crises. The Trade Federation's droid patrols were sweeping in expanding grids. Kagan had memorized the pattern within the first hour of planetfall and had been navigating around it since. Data observed the route selection, and within 4 minutes had independently calculated the same optimal path, which he found both efficient and quietly impressive. "What are you?" Obi-Wan asked. It was not rude, exactly. It was the question of a young man whose worldview had just acquired an unwelcome complication and who preferred to address complications directly. "I am an android," Data said. "An artificial life form constructed by a cybernetic scientist named Noonian. So, my cognitive architecture is based on a positronic neural net. I am capable of processing approximately 60 trillion operations per second. I do not require sleep or sustenance, and I experience neither fear nor physical fatigue." He considered. "I also play the violin, though I do not currently have one available." Obi-Wan stared at him. "He's a droid," he said to Kagan. "I have heard that comparison before," Data said. "It is not entirely inaccurate, though I would note that the distinction between a sophisticated droid and an artificial life form capable of genuine, independent reasoning is a subject of considerable philosophical debate in my own galaxy." "In ours as well," Kagan said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite a smile but occupied the same general space. They reached the edge of the swamp as the sun moved behind a bank of low cloud, and the capital city of Theed became visible. Across the open ground ahead, its pale domes and carved facades beautiful and incongruous above the reality of military occupation. Trade Federation landing craft sat on the outer plazas like great gray beetles. Droid patrols moved in the streets below in formations, visible even at this distance. Data cataloged everything, cross-referencing it against the combat drone specifications he had already observed, and began building a tactical picture with the automatic diligence of a Starfleet officer who had learned that information gathered before a crisis was always more useful than information gathered during one. "The city is occupied," he said. "Yes," Kagan said. "The droid forces are deployed in a standard perimeter and sweep configuration. Their patrol intervals are consistent and predictable. Their command structure appears to be centralized. The units I encountered in the swamp responded to orders rather than initiative. Disrupting the command signal would likely cause significant tactical disorganization." Kagan stopped walking and looked at him with the full weight of that impossible force reading attention. "You determined all of that in the last 4 minutes," he said. 3 minutes and 47 seconds, Data said. "I did not wish to interrupt the conversation." Obi-Wan made a sound that he quickly converted into a cough. Kagan resumed walking. "Commander Data, I have a mission here on Naboo that requires me to reach the Queen and evacuate her from this planet. The Force has placed you in my path for a reason. I do not yet fully understand, perhaps because it cannot speak to you directly and so speaks through circumstance instead." He glanced sideways. "Can you fight?" "Yes," Data said simply. "Against more than 3 droids?" "The number is not a significant variable." For the first time since the swamp, something moved in Qui-Gon's expression that was not merely assessment. It was, Data would later reflect, the look of a man who had just recalculated his odds and found them improved. "Then stay close," Kagan said. "We will explain the situation as we move. There is a great deal you need to understand about this galaxy." "I am aware," Data said. "I have approximately 473 questions. I will attempt to prioritize them. Start with the most important one." Data considered for exactly 0.8 seconds. "Who are you at war with?" he said. "And why?" Kagan almost smiled. "That," he said, "is exactly the right question." They crossed toward Theed as the clouds thickened overhead and the distant sound of droid patrols echoed off pale stone, and Data walked between a Jedi Master and his apprentice through a world that had no category for him. and began, with characteristic thoroughness, to learn it anyway. The Thebe power generator was the kind of place that made organic beings feel small. Data did not feel small. He did not, strictly speaking, feel, but he processed the architectural scale with something his behavioral subroutines registered as appreciation. The facility descended in massive concentric tiers into the planet's crust, each level connected by narrow catwalks. Above shafts of humming plasma energy that cast everything in shifting blue-white light. The air smelled of ozone and superheated metal. The sound was a constant low-frequency vibration that data measured at 47 Hz, below human hearing threshold, but present, pervasive, felt in the chest rather than heard by the ear. He had been on Naboo for 6 hours and 42 minutes. In that time, he had learned the following. The planet was under illegal military occupation by an organization called the Trade Federation, acting under the covert direction of a Sith Lord whose identity remained unknown. The indigenous human population had been herded into camps. The native Gungan species, Jar Jar's people, had agreed to provide a military diversion on the plains. Outside the city, Queen Amidala and her security forces were attempting to capture the Trade Federation's viceroy, Newt Gunray, in the palace, and Qui-Gon Jinn, Jedi Master, was leading a small group through the generator complex toward the hangar beyond it, where they needed to reach the Queen's starship. The plan had been proceeding with reasonable efficiency until the figure dropped from the shadows above them. Data saw him before anyone else reacted. His visual processing registered the movement. 0.3 seconds ahead of human perception, cataloging the threat in the same instant. Male, athletic build, Zobric species, cranial horns, facial markings in a geometric pattern of red and black. Twin-bladed lightsaber, a weapon configuration Qui-Gon had described during their transit through the city as exceptionally rare and exceptionally dangerous. The Force signature coming off him, Qui-Gon had told him to watch for a darkness that bent the air around it like heat-off metal. Data could not feel the Force, but he could see the way. Qui-Gon's posture changed the instant the figure landed, and that told him everything the Force could not. Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon said quietly, "Get to the ship. Master, get Queen Amidala to the ship. Go." Data did not move. Qui-Gon ignited his lightsaber, green plasma blade, humming with contained energy, and the figure across the catwalk ignited his own weapon, red blades blazing at both ends. And for a moment the two of them regarded each other across 20 meters of blue-lit air above a shaft of plasma, energy deep enough to be effectively bottomless. "You should go with your companion," Qui-Gon said to Data, not taking his eyes off the Sith. "I assessed the tactical situation and determined that your probability of surviving this engagement without assistance is significantly reduced," Data said. "I elected to remain." Qui-Gon did not have time to argue. The Sith moved. He was fast, faster than the battle droids by an order of magnitude, faster than most of the combat scenarios Data had processed in Starfleet training simulations. He crossed the distance to Qui-Gon in a blur of motion, double blades spinning in a pattern designed to overwhelm a single opponent's defensive capacity. Qui-Gon met him with skill and calm, green blade intercepting red in a cascade of deflections, footwork precise and economical across the narrow catwalk. Data watched for 4 seconds. He cataloged the Sith's attack patterns, a preference for his left side blade on opening strikes, a slight over-rotation on the spinning return that created a 0.3-second window of exposure at the right shoulder, and a tendency to drive opponents backward toward the plasma shaft rather than laterally, using depth as a psychological weapon. He also noted that Qui-Gon was being pushed back. The Sith was stronger in raw combat terms, his strikes carrying a ferocity that went beyond technique into something that seemed to amplify his physical capacity. The Force, Data understood, being used not just as a guidance system, but as a direct power source. Qui-Gon was defending brilliantly, but defending nonetheless, and the catwalk narrowed behind him toward a dead end at the shaft's edge. Data moved along the perpendicular catwalk, closing the angle, calculating. He had no lightsaber. He had no phaser. He had no weapon of any kind that this galaxy would recognize. What he had was a positronic brain capable of calculating combat, trajectories to 14 decimal places. A body composed of materials that could withstand forces well beyond what a lightsaber strike would deliver in the zero point 0.3 seconds of contact his plan required, and the complete absence of the one thing that made organic beings hesitate at moments like this. He felt no fear at all. The Sith drove Kagan back with a savage overhead combination, and in the moment the Jedi Master's blade was occupied, absorbing the strike in that precise 0.4-second window. When the Sith's weight was committed forward and his left side was open, Data stepped off the perpendicular catwalk onto the main span in 2 strides and drove his shoulder into the Sith's left flank with 1,400 newtons of precisely directed force. The impact was not elegant. It was not a martial technique or a combat maneuver in any classical sense. It was physics, applied with android precision at the exact moment physics would be most effective. The Sith, Darth Maul, though Data did not yet know his name, was not knocked from the catwalk. He was too skilled, too fast. His recovery reflexes augmented by the force in ways Data could not fully account for. But he was moved, knocked sideways rather than forward. His momentum broken, his attack sequence interrupted, and Kagan, given that single recovered second, used it. He did not strike to kill. He stepped back, reset his stance, and re-established his defensive position with the calm of a man who had just been given a breath of air. After being held underwater, it was enough. The rhythm of the duel shifted from desperate defense to something more equitable, more controlled. Maul turned to look at Data with eyes that were yellow and ancient and absolutely cold. Data looked back with eyes that were yellow and unreadable and contained no fear whatsoever. Something moved across Maul's face that was not quite surprise, but was the closest thing to it his Sith conditioning allowed. He had faced Jedi. He had faced warriors and soldiers and beings of considerable power. He had never faced something that looked back at him with such complete, undisturbed calm and had clearly not been moved by his presence in any direction at all. He attacked them both. What followed was not a coordinated defense. Data had no lightsaber, no ability to deflect energy blades, no combat partnership with Kagan, established beyond 6 hours of walking and talking. What it was adaptive. Data moved to draw Maul's attention at every moment. The Sith focused entirely on Kagan, not engaging the lightsaber directly, but disrupting the footwork, the positioning, the psychological dominance that Maul used as a weapon as much as his blade. He absorbed one glancing strike across his left forearm. The plasma burned through his uniform and scored the surface layer of his chassis, which he registered as significant damage and immediately deprioritized and used the contact to grip Maul's weapon arm for 0.6 seconds, long enough for Kagan to disengage and create separation. Maul pulled free with a snarl and looked between them. Then, with the tactical intelligence of a trained Sith assassin who understood when a situation had become unexpectedly complicated, he retreated, not in defeat, but in the deliberate way of someone choosing the terms of their next engagement rather than accepting the terms of this one. He was gone into the upper shadows of the generator before the echo of the last lightsaber strike had faded. Kagan stood breathing in the blue light, his saber still ignited, and looked at Data. Data was examining the burn mark on his forearm with calm, analytical attention. The damage was real, a 4.7 centimeter score through his outer casing, exposing the secondary conduit layer beneath. He would need to address it when materials were available. For now, it was non-critical. "You are damaged," Kagan said. "Yes," Data said. "It is not presently debilitating." He looked up. "You are uninjured?" Kagan checked himself almost reflexively. "Yes." He deactivated his lightsaber. In the sudden reduction of light, his expression was unguarded. For just a moment, something between gratitude and a depth of contemplation that suggested this moment was already rearranging things inside him. "You stepped into a duel with a Sith Lord," he said. "Without a weapon, without the Force, without," he paused, "without hesitation." "Hesitation would have been inefficient," Data said. "You required assistance. I was capable of providing it." The calculation was straightforward. Kagan was quiet for a moment. Then, "In all my years, I have never met anyone quite like you, Commander Data." "I am told that frequently," Data said. and began walking toward the hangar. Tatooine was, by any measurable standard, one of the least hospitable environments Data had yet encountered. He had processed records of inhospitable environments in considerable volume during his years aboard the Enterprise, volcanic moons, frozen methane plains, planets whose atmospheres consisted primarily of compounds corrosive to human tissue. Tatooine offered none of these extremes. What it offered instead was something subtler and, in its way, more comprehensive, a total, remorseless indifference to the comfort of anything living within it. The twin suns were the primary factor. They hung in the pale sky like two unblinking eyes, and the heat they generated between them was not the wet, organic heat of Naboo's swamps, but something drier and more absolute, a heat that pulled moisture from surfaces, bleached color from fabric, and made the air itself shimmer in visible waves above the pale sand. Data's internal temperature regulation systems compensated automatically, but he noted that every organic being around him was in a constant, low-level negotiation with the environment simply to maintain biological function. He found it an interesting place. They had landed outside Mos Espa, after Queen Amidala's ship sustained hyperdrive damage escaping the blockade, a technical problem that Kagan had assessed with characteristic calm and set about solving through the most available resource, the settlement itself. Data had accompanied him into the city while Obi-Wan remained with the ship. The streets of Mos Espa were narrow and loud, packed with species Data had no catalog entry for, smelling of roasting meat and engine exhaust and something sweetly fermented he could not immediately identify. Merchant stalls crowded every surface. Overhead, pod racing banners in faded colors snapped in the hot wind. Data observed everything and said very little, which was unusual for him. He was, however, engaged in something that required more processing than simple observation. He was watching the people, and he was thinking about what Kagan had told him during the flight. The Force connects all living things, Kagan had said, standing in the small crew cabin of the Naboo royal cruiser with his hands folded, and his eyes carrying that quality of patient certainty that Data had begun to recognize as the man's default relationship with the universe. It flows through every being, binds the galaxy together. Some are more attuned to it than others, and in very rare cases, a being carries such a high concentration of midi-chlorians in their cells that the Force speaks through them directly. We call such beings the Chosen. Data had asked the obvious question. Chosen for what? Kagan had smiled and said, that is what we are going to Tatooine to find out. The boy was crouching beside a half-dismantled droid when Data first saw him. He was perhaps 9 years old, with sandy hair and eyes the color of a clear sky at midday, and he was working on the droid's motivator assembly with the focused, unself-conscious absorption of someone for whom mechanical problems were not puzzles to be solved, but conversations to be had. His hands were quick and certain, not the cautious movements of a child learning, but the efficient motions of someone who had been doing this long enough that the knowledge lived in his fingers rather than his conscious mind. He wore a rough-spun tunic the color of sand and had the particular quality of leanness that came not from youth but from a life in which nutrition was not guaranteed. He looked up when they approached his stall, and his eyes moved immediately to Data, not with the wariness that most beings displayed on first encountering him, not with the uncertain politeness of someone trying to determine what category to file him in, with open, uncomplicated fascination. Are you a droid? The boy asked. I am an android, Data said. The distinction is a matter of some philosophical significance, though I acknowledge it may not be immediately apparent from visual observation. The boy stood up, wiping his hands on his tunic, and walked directly toward Data with the complete lack of social hesitation that belonged exclusively to children and very experienced soldiers. He walked a slow half-circle around him, examining him with the same quality of attention he had been giving the motivator assembly moments before. Your joints are different, the boy said. The articulation around the wrist is smoother than any droid I've seen. What's your power source? A quantum-level energy matrix embedded within my positronic brain structure. Data said. It is self-sustaining and does not require external fuel cells. The boy's eyes widened. Self-sustaining? How? Anakin, said a woman's voice from inside the stall, warm, tired, with an undercurrent of practiced worry that Data associated with parents of children who regularly did things that were inadvisable but not yet catastrophic. Mom, come look at this. Called back, still staring at Data. He's not like any droid I've ever seen. He doesn't have a power cell. He has a, what did you call it? A positronic neural net, Data said. A positronic neural net. Anakin said it the way someone repeats a phrase in a foreign language, carefully committing it to memory in real time. Can I see your arm? The one that got burned. Data extended his left forearm. The scored section of his outer casing was still visible, a dark line across the pale surface where Maul's lightsaber had made contact. Anakin crouched to look at it with the focused attention of a diagnostician. Plasma burn, he said immediately. The secondary layer beneath is that a conduit? Running parallel to the primary motor system? A redundant motor pathway, yes. A failsafe. So even if the main system was cut, you could still function. Yes. Anakin looked up at him. Something moved. In his expression, that was more complex than simple curiosity, recognition, perhaps. The specific quality of interest that passed between two beings who had found, unexpectedly, that someone else understood the language they thought they spoke alone. I'm building a droid, Anakin said. A protocol droid. For my mom. He doesn't have coverings yet, but his cognitive matrix is almost finished. I built him from scavenged parts, but the language processor keeps misaligning with the memory core, and I can't figure out why. May I examine it? Data asked. Anakin looked briefly at Kagan, who had been standing slightly apart, watching this exchange with an expression Data was beginning to recognize as the one the Jedi Master wore when the Force was doing something he found interesting. Kagan gave a small nod. Anakin led Data inside. The droid was C-3PO, though Data did not know his designation yet, and the droid himself was in no condition to provide it. His skeletal frame seated against the wall with his photoreceptors dim and his vocabulator unconnected. Data crouched beside him and began a careful assessment, his fingers moving across the exposed circuitry with the precise, gentle attention of a surgeon. The language processor misalignment was immediately apparent. The memory core was operating on a slightly different timing cycle, a gap of 0.0003 seconds that would cause cascading desynchronization under any complex linguistic load. Data diagnosed it in 40 seconds and explained the problem to Anakin in terms that a 9-year-old with exceptional mechanical aptitude could follow, which turned out to require almost no simplification at all. Anakin listened with total concentration and then said, "Can you show me how to fix it?" "Yes," Data said. They worked together for the next hour and 20 minutes. Shmi Skywalker brought water and watched from the doorway with an expression that Data cataloged as the particular mix of relief and aching tenderness that parents display when their exceptional children find, even briefly, someone who can match them. Kagan sat nearby and said very little, but Data observed him, taking a small sample collector from his robe at one point and reaching toward Anakin's work surface in a motion so casual it was clearly designed not to be noticed. Data noticed. He filed it without comment. "How did you get here?" Anakin asked, at some point during the second half of the hour, not looking up from the circuit board they were working on together. "A dimensional anomaly," Data said. "I was pulled from my own galaxy into this one. Do you want to go back?" Data considered the question with the genuine attention it deserved. "I do not know yet," he said, which was more honest than his usual precision allowed for, and surprised him slightly. Anakin nodded, as if this were a perfectly reasonable answer. "I want to leave too," he said quietly. "Not because I don't love it here, but because I feel like," he stopped, then continued with the careful phrasing of a child who has learned that some thoughts make adults uncomfortable, like there's something I'm supposed to do, somewhere out there. And being here is like knowing the answer to a problem, but not being allowed to write it down. Data looked at the boy. In his years aboard the Enterprise, he had spent considerable effort attempting to understand what humans meant when they described intuition, that non-analytical sense of pattern recognition that bypassed conscious reasoning and arrived at conclusions through pathways that left no traceable logic. He had never been certain he understood it from the inside. But looking at Anakin Skywalker, he thought he understood it from the outside. This boy was going to matter. Not because a Jedi Master believed it, not because ancient prophecy suggested it, but because everything about him, the quality of his attention, the speed of his mind, the specific frequency of his restlessness suggested a being whose potential was already pressing against the boundaries of what his current circumstances could contain. Data returned to the circuit board. "I believe," he said carefully, "that you will not be here much longer." Anakin looked up. His eyes were very bright. "Is that a prediction?" he asked. "It is an assessment," Data said, "based on available evidence." Anakin smiled, a quick, unguarded thing, and turned back to the board. Outside, the twin suns were beginning their long descent toward the horizon, and Mos Espa cooled by fractions as the shadows lengthened across the sand. Kagan sat in the doorway of the stall, watching the street, and Data was aware, through no mechanism he could name or quantify, that something had shifted in the architecture of whatever was happening around him. He did not yet have a word for it. He filed the sensation underpinning classification and kept working. Coruscant from above was a contradiction that Data found genuinely arresting. Every surface of the planet was city, not city in the way. Mos Espa was city, a settlement pressed against the edge of survival, improvised and organic and carrying the smell of its own effort. But city in the way a machine was a machine, total, deliberate. Every square meter accounted for an assigned a function within a system so vast. It had ceased to be a place and become, instead, a condition. Lights covered the night side, in grids of amber and white that mimicked the star fields above with uncomfortable precision. Landing corridors threaded between towers that scraped the upper atmosphere. Beneath those towers, Data had been told, the city descended 4 kilometers into darkness where the original planetary surface had not been seen in centuries. He stood at the viewport of the Naboo royal cruiser as they descended through the traffic lanes and processed the scale with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things that genuinely challenged his existing frameworks. "You are quiet," Obi-Wan said, coming to stand beside him. Their relationship had developed across the journey from Tatooine into something Data would have classified as cautious mutual respect. Obi-Wan was precise, principled, and possessed of a dry, observational wit that surfaced at unexpected moments in which Data found, if not exactly humorous, then at least consistently interesting. "I am processing," Data said. "The city, among other things." He turned from the viewport. "I have been considering the Jedi Order." Obi-Wan raised an eyebrow. "Conclusions?" "Several. I would prefer to share them with appropriate context, rather than in isolation." He paused. "I have also been considering Anakin." Something shifted in Obi-Wan's expression, not quite discomfort, but the adjacent territory. "Kagan believes he is the chosen one," he said carefully. "Yes, he told me as much on Tatooine." Data looked back at the viewport. "I have been attempting to understand what that means in practical terms. In my own galaxy, prophecy is a concept I have encountered primarily in historical and anthropological contexts. It is rarely treated as an operational framework. The Jedi don't treat it lightly either," Obi-Wan said. "The Council will need to be convinced. And if they are not..." Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment. "Then Kagan will do what Kagan does," he said, with a tone that contained, in equal measure, exasperation and deep, unshakable affection. The Jedi Temple was the other contradiction. Of Coruscant, ancient, in a city of relentless modernity, its 4 spires rising from a broad base that had been here, Obi-Wan told him, for over 1,000 years. Inside, everything was stone and light and a quality of silence that was not the absence of sound but the presence of something else entirely. Data walked through its corridors and noted that every Jedi they passed responded to him in one of 2 ways: with the careful neutrality of trained observation, or with a very subtle shift in posture that his behavioral analysis cataloged as unease. They felt nothing from him, and beings who navigated reality through feeling found nothing profoundly disorienting. The High Council chamber was at the top of one of the spires, a circular room with tall windows on all sides, open to the cityscape in every direction. 12 seats arranged in a ring. 11 were occupied by Jedi Masters whose names Data cataloged as Kagan provided them in low murmurs during the approach. Mace Windu, Kiadimundi, Plo Koon, Adi Gallia, and others. The 12th seat, small, positioned to one side, held a being so ancient that the force seemed to pool around him like water finding low ground. Yoda, 900 years old, Kagan had said, the eldest and perhaps the wisest living Jedi. Data looked at him with the genuine, unguarded interest he brought to things that fell entirely outside his prior experience. And Yoda looked back at Data with small, luminous eyes that were doing something no other eyes in the room were doing. They were amused. Commander Data, Mace Windu said. His voice carried natural authority, not performed, not imposed, but resident. The way gravity was resident in mass. He was a man who had spent decades being the most capable person in any room and had achieved a stillness about it. Kagan has described your arrival and your actions on Naboo. We have questions. I would expect so, Data said. I have questions as well. Perhaps we can exchange them. A brief silence. Mace Windu's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes recalculated. You are not in the Force, Kiadimundi said. The Syrian master leaned forward slightly. His elongated skull tilted at an angle that suggested deep puzzlement. I have never encountered a living being I could not sense in the Force. Even droids carry a kind of residual impression from the beings who built them. You carry nothing. I am aware, Data said. I do not experience the Force and cannot be influenced by it. I would note, however, that the absence of a Force signature does not indicate the absence of moral or cognitive capacity. My ethical reasoning is internally generated rather than externally conferred. You reason your way to morality, Mace Windu said. Yes. And what does your reasoning tell you about this room? Data considered that there are 12 highly capable individuals attempting to assess whether I represent a threat, an asset, or a category error. That the primary concern is not my capabilities but my unpredictability, specifically, the fact that I cannot be read, guided, or if necessary, restrained through the Force. And that the secondary concern, which no one has yet raised directly, is my relationship with the boy from Tatooine. Another silence. Longer this time. Yoda made a sound that Data's audio processing identified as a soft exhale through the nose, the physiological correlate, in many species, of something between a laugh and a sigh. Perceptive, he is, Yoda said. His eyes remained on Data with that settled, untroubled attention. Feel you, I cannot. And yet, here you are. Placed, perhaps, by something older than the Force itself. He tapped his Jimmer stick against the floor once, thoughtfully. Troubled, this makes me. And curious. Both things at once. I understand the feeling, Data said. This time, Yoda did smile. Kagan presented Anakin's case with the quiet conviction of a man who has staked his professional reputation on a belief and is prepared to defend it with complete equanimity regardless of the outcome. The council listened. They asked questions about the midi-chlorian count, the highest ever recorded, a number that Mace Windu received with an expression of carefully controlled gravity. They asked about the boy's circumstances, his training, his age. They were reluctant. Data could read reluctance in organic beings with reasonable accuracy, and what he observed around the ring of seats was not hostility, but the specific caution of experienced minds confronting something that exceeded their established parameters. He understood that feeling from the inside. After Kagan had finished, Mace Windu turned to Data with the directness of a man who had decided to address the complication he had been holding in reserve. And you, he said, what are your intentions here, Commander? I do not have intentions in the strategic sense, Data said. I have no faction to serve, no objective to pursue beyond understanding my situation and behaving in accordance with my ethical principles. On Naboo, I assisted Kagan Jinn because he required assistance and I was capable of providing it. Those conditions have not changed. And if they conflict, your principles and our needs, then we will discuss it, Data said. I am not accustomed to unconditional allegiance to institutions. I am, however, accustomed to working with people I respect toward ends I believe are just. Whether the Jedi Order qualifies on both counts is something I am still determining. The silence this time had a different quality. Not cold, more like the silence of a room in which something has been said that everyone is quietly deciding how to respond to. Mace Windu looked at him for a long moment. You're very direct. I have been told this as well, Data said. Yoda's ear shifted. Stay, will you? On Coruscant, while we deliberate. I have nowhere else to go, Data said. And a great deal more to learn about this galaxy. I will stay. He did not add that he had already noted which corridor connected the council chamber to the creche where the Jedi younglings were housed, or that Anakin Skywalker had been brought to the temple that morning, and was almost certainly somewhere in this building right now, probably taking apart something he shouldn't. He simply folded his hands behind his back and waited for what came next. Senator Sheev Palpatine's office occupied a high floor of the Senate, district's most prestigious residential tower, and it was decorated with the specific taste of a man who understood that aesthetics were a form of argument. Everything in it was old, not ancient in the way the Jedi Temple was ancient, carrying the weight of accumulated purpose, but old in the way of deliberate collection of objects chosen because they communicated something about their owner. Naboo artifacts, antique manuscripts under glass, a view of the cityscape through tall windows that positioned the visitor, always with their back to the light and their face in partial shadow. Data noted all of this in the first 4 seconds. He had been invited, the word Palpatine's aide had used, with the careful emphasis of someone, conveying that the invitation was not precisely optional, to a private meeting 2 days after the council session. Kagan had not been summoned. Obi-Wan had not been summoned. The invitation had come specifically and solely for Commander Data, which was itself a data point of considerable significance. Palpatine rose from behind his desk when Data entered, and the smile he offered was warm, practiced, and reached, his eyes with the precision of a man who had spent decades ensuring that it did. Commander Data, he said. Thank you for coming. Please sit. Thank you, Senator, Data said, and sat, and began collecting information. Palpatine settled back into his chair with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his environment, which was to say entirely comfortable with the power the environment represented. He was studying Data with an attention that was less like the Jedi Council's careful, force-aided assessment and more like something Data recognized from his own analytical processes, the systematic cataloging of an unknown variable. I've heard remarkable things about what happened on Naboo, Palpatine said. An extraordinary being from beyond our galaxy, arriving at precisely the moment a Jedi Master faced mortal danger. The Force works in mysterious ways. A small pause, perfectly weighted. Or so the Jedi would say. You do not share their interpretation, Data said. Palpatine's smile shifted by a fraction, pleased, as if a student had answered correctly. I share their respect for the extraordinary. I am simply more interested in understanding it than in attributing it to mysticism. He leaned forward slightly. You are a being of pure reason, Commander. I suspect you find that a more comfortable framework as well. I find accurate frameworks comfortable, Data said. Whether they are rational or mystical is secondary to whether they correspond to observable reality. Admirably precise. Palpatine folded his hands on the desk. I want to speak plainly with you, if I may. The Jedi are a remarkable institution, but they are also an insular one. They will assess you through the lens of the Force, and when they find you absent from it, they will be uncertain how to classify you. Uncertainty, in my experience, tends to resolve toward caution. He let that sit for a moment. The Senate, on the other hand, has no such limitation. We deal in capability and result. And your capability, from what I have heard, is extraordinary. You are suggesting an alternative affiliation, Data said. I am suggesting that a being of your nature deserves more options than the Jedi Council is likely to offer. Palpatine's voice was measured, reasonable, carrying the particular warmth of someone delivering self-interest, wrapped in genuine-sounding concern. The Republic faces significant threats. The Trade Federation's aggression on Naboo was not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of deeper instabilities. A being who cannot be manipulated through the Force, who processes tactical information at speeds no organic mind can match, who requires no sleep, no food, no rest. Such a being could be invaluable. In the right context. Data looked at him. He had encountered manipulative individuals before. Q on the Enterprise had elevated manipulation to something approaching an art form. Various adversaries across his years of Starfleet service had attempted to use him, his processing capacity, his loyalty, his occasionally literal interpretation of language, as a tool for ends he had not agreed to serve. He had developed, through experience rather than instinct, a reliable method of identifying such attempts. The method was simple. He listened not to what was being said, but to what was being assumed. And what Palpatine was assuming, beneath every carefully chosen word, was that Data's capabilities were a resource to be allocated, and that the primary question was who should control the allocation. No one who saw him as a person rather than a resource led with capability assessments. I appreciate your candor, Senator, Data said. I will offer some in return. I do not form affiliations based on offered advantages. My decisions regarding who I work with and toward what ends are determined by my ethical principles, not by assessments of institutional benefit. He paused precisely. I am also aware that you have not asked me a single question about my own nature, my origin, or my experience. You have asked exclusively about my capabilities. I find that informative. Palpatine was quiet. The smile remained. The man had extraordinary discipline, but something behind it had recalibrated. He was, Data assessed, genuinely surprised. Not offended. Not hostile. Surprised, in the way of someone who has set a sophisticated trap and watched the intended subject walk around it without apparent effort. You're more perceptive than I anticipated, Palpatine said. The warmth in his voice had not disappeared, but it had become something more genuine and therefore more interesting. He was looking at Data now with the eyes of a man who had encountered something he needed to revise his models to accommodate. I am told that as well, Data said pleasantly. And the boy, Palpatine said, shifting with the smoothness of an experienced conversationalist. Anakin Skywalker. You've spent time with him. Yes. What do you make of him? Data considered whether to answer, what to answer, and how much of his answer to share. The calculation took 0.6 seconds, which was long by his standards. He is exceptional, Data said. Intelligent, intuitive, capable of remarkable focus. He is also 9 years old, recently separated from his mother, and being assessed by multiple powerful institutions simultaneously, for purposes that no one has explained. To him with full honesty, he met Palpatine's eyes without difficulty. I find that I am more interested in his well-being than in his potential. Something moved across Palpatine's face, fleeting, quickly controlled, but present. Data cataloged it without expression. It was not anger. It was not dismissal. It was the specific reaction of someone who has just been told something they did not expect and are busy integrating. You care for him, Palpatine said. Data considered the word carefully. I am not certain I am capable of caring in the way you mean, he said. But I have concluded that his situation warrants attention from someone whose primary motivation is his welfare rather than his utility. Whether that constitutes caring is a question I am still examining. Palpatine nodded slowly, as if filing this information in a system whose purpose he was already redesigning. I hope, he said, that we will speak again, Commander. I expect we will. Senator, Data said and rose, and took his leave with the same unhurried precision with which he had entered. In the corridor outside, walking back through the Senate District's polished halls toward the Jedi Temple, Data ran the conversation through his analytical processes in full. Every exchange, every weighted pause, every question asked and not asked. The particular quality of Palpatine's attention to Anakin's name. He did not have a conclusion yet. What he had was something more valuable at this stage, a well-defined question. He filed it carefully, labeled it priority, and kept walking. The Battle of Naboo began at dawn. Data observed the initial deployment from the crest of a grass-covered ridge overlooking the Naboo plain. Standing beside Captain Panica and 3 of the Queen's most senior security officers, and processed the tactical situation with the systematic thoroughness he brought to every problem that had lives attached to its solution. Below, the Gungan Grand Army had taken its position, a broad line of mounted warriors and infantry arranged across the plain with the disciplined courage of people who understood. They were the distraction and had chosen to be it anyway. Boss Nass had committed his people to a role that required them to absorb the trade federation's initial assault while Queen Amidala's strike team moved on the palace, and the specific quality of that sacrifice was not lost on Data even as he calculated the force ratios with cold precision. The numbers were not good. They were, in fact, very bad. The Trade Federation's droid army emerged from its encampment in columns that stretched back further than visible range. AATs moving in armor formations. MTTs disgorging infantry units in continuous streams. Droid fighters in air cover patterns overhead. The Gungan energy shields absorbed the first artillery salvos in shimmering blue flashes. But the shield generators had limits that physics did not negotiate with. And the droid army had the patient, mechanical certainty of forces that did not tire, did not fear, and had been programmed to continue until the objective was achieved or they were individually destroyed. Data had spent the previous evening while Kagan meditated and Obi-Wan sharpened his focus in the temple's training halls, and Anakin, under the watchful eye of a protocol-conscious Jedi archivist, had somehow acquired access to a navigation simulator and was teaching himself to calculate hyperspace jumps, running through every available tactical scenario he could model. With the information at hand, he had found 3 viable intervention points. The first was the shield generator defense, reinforcing the Gungan line at the point where the AAT formations would concentrate their fire, extending the shield network's effective lifespan by disrupting the targeting coordination of the leading armor units. The second was the droid control ship, the central vessel in orbit that coordinated all ground unit functions through a continuous signal. Disrupt the signal, and every battle droid on the plane would cease to function. The third was the command network itself. The Trade Federation's tactical droids operated on a hierarchical decision tree with clear nodes, and removing those nodes in the correct sequence would cause cascading tactical paralysis even before any signal disruption occurred. He could not address the orbital control ship. He had no vessel, no means of reaching orbit, and no way to interface with systems he had not yet examined. He could, however, address the command network. Captain Panica had looked at Data's proposed approach with the expression of a man who had spent his career protecting a monarch through careful, methodical planning, and was now being asked to accept a significant deviation from everything he understood about how military operations worked. Then he had looked at Data's tactical breakdown, the node positions, the sequence, the timing windows, and his expression had changed to something more like the face of a man doing rapid arithmetic and arriving at a number he hadn't expected. You can move between those positions without being detected? Panica had asked. Detection is not a concern I weigh heavily, Data had said. The battle droid's targeting systems prioritize organic life signs. I produce none. Their threat assessment protocols do not have a category for what I am. He had paused. This is an advantage I intend to use. Now, on the ridge, as the first wave of the droid assault crashed against the Gungan shields and the plane filled with the sound of energy, weapons, and the deep percussion of artillery, Data descended from the ridge without ceremony and moved into the battle. It was unlike anything he had experienced in Starfleet service, and Starfleet service had taken him to some genuinely unusual places. The scale was different, not larger than some engagements he had processed in historical records, but more immediate, more granular. The chaos of individual combat, units and broken formations, and the specific human and Gungan cost of every tactical decision made or missed. All of it happening simultaneously across a kilometer of open ground. Data moved through it with his targeting systems fully engaged, processing threat vectors and safe corridors in real time, calculating the position of every droid unit within his sensor range and updating the model. With each new data point, the first tactical droid command node was directing a column of AATs toward the Gungan shield's weakest sector. Data located it, assessed the security around it, 6 standard battle droids, 1 super battle droid in close support, and addressed the situation in 38 seconds. He did not use a blaster. He did not have one. What he had was the ability to move with precision that droid targeting systems were not calibrated to track, the physical strength to dismantle battle droids with direct contact, and the processing speed to do both simultaneously, while updating his tactical model and moving to the next objective. The AAT column, deprived of its coordination node, defaulted to its last programmed instruction and held position. The Gungan line bought 4 additional minutes of shield integrity at that sector. For minutes, data calculated, was worth approximately 200 Gungan lives at the current attrition rate. He moved to the second node. The battle had its own rhythm, a terrible, grinding rhythm of pressure and response. The Gungans bending but not breaking. Their Bulma projectiles, disrupting droid formations with unpredictable, kinetic results that even Data's models had not fully anticipated. Boss Nass had positioned his cavalry with more sophistication than a surface analysis of Gungan military history would have suggested, and Data noted this with the appreciation he reserved for competence encountered in unexpected places. He was neutralizing the third command node, a tactical droid directing a flanking maneuver that would have rolled up the Gungan line from the east within minutes. When the battle center shifted, the energy shield collapsed. It happened in sections, the blue shimmer failing outward from 2 generator positions simultaneously, and the droid army poured through the gaps with the mechanical certainty of water finding breaches in a wall. The Gungans fell back in good order, not a rout, a retreat, which was a meaningful distinction, but the plane was suddenly much more dangerous, and the timeline for every other element of the plan had just compressed severely. Data recalculated in 0.4 seconds and began moving toward the largest concentration of advancing droid units. What he did in the next 22 minutes was not something he would have predicted of himself before arriving in this galaxy. It was not a series of tactical decisions in the clean, sequential sense that after-action reports implied. It was adaptation, continuous, real-time, unglamorous adaptation, the kind that required processing hundreds of variables simultaneously while physically moving through a battlefield and making contact with enemy units at a rate that would have been impossible for any organic combatant operating alone. He destroyed 41 battle droids through direct intervention. He disrupted 2 more command nodes. He redirected a column of advancing units into a marshy ground sector where their treads lost traction and their formation collapsed. He assisted 3 wounded Gungan warriors to a position behind the retreating line, carrying 2 of them simultaneously. He did not feel heroic. He did not feel anything in the way heroism was usually described. What he felt, or what the nearest available internal state to feeling produced, was something closer to the focused satisfaction of a complex problem receiving a complete solution. But the solution was not yet complete, because even as the droid army's ground advance stalled and fragmented under the combined effect of Gungan resistance and his own systematic disruption, Data's tactical model was producing a result he did not like. The droid army was large enough to recover from node disruption given sufficient time. The Gungan forces were too depleted to press an advantage. And in orbit, the droid control ship continued its transmission, patient and automated and entirely indifferent to what was happening below. Everything on this battlefield was a delay. The actual solution was somewhere above them. He stood in the middle of the battered plane, processing the tactical picture, and looked up at the sky where nothing was yet visible, and understood that the next phase of this battle was going to happen somewhere he could not reach, piloted by someone he had known for less than 2 weeks. A 9-year-old boy. Data ran the probability assessments and filed them without sharing them with anyone, because there was no value in distributing information that could not be acted upon and would only generate fear in those who received it. Then he turned back to the battle in front of him and kept working. Darth Maul found Data in the corridor outside the Thebe Palace throne room. It was not an accident. Data had understood from the moment the battle's ground phase began to resolve in the Gungans' favor. Fragile, costly, uncertain, but resolved nonetheless that the Sith warriors' return was a matter of timing rather than possibility. Maul had retreated from the generator confrontation with the calculated patience of someone who had not been defeated, but had been interrupted, and there was a quality to that kind of interrupted purpose that Data's behavioral analysis associated with entities that did not abandon objectives, but merely deferred them. He had been moving through the palace corridors assisting Queen Amidala's security teams in clearing droid resistance, systematic work, methodical, the kind of sustained, close-quarters combat that required continuous threat assessment and left no margin for distraction. When he became aware of a change in the quality of the silence ahead of him, Data did not feel the force. He could not sense the dark sides, pressure, or the specific chill that Kagan had described as the Sith's signature in the living current of the galaxy. What he could do was process environmental data with a precision that organic senses could not match, and what the environmental data told him. In the 3 seconds before Maul stepped from the shadowed alcove at the corridor's end, was this: the droid activity in this section had ceased completely, in a pattern inconsistent with the broader battle's ebb and flow. The silence had a shape. Something had cleared this corridor deliberately, something that wanted an uninterrupted encounter. Maul stepped into the light. He looked different than he had in the generator, on Naboo's plasma catwalks. He had been a figure in motion, all velocity and controlled fury, the double blade a constant extension of his attack, his presence defined by what he was doing. Here, standing still in the corridors, pale light with his lightsaber, unignited, and his yellow eyes fixed on Data with an attention that was almost meditative, he was something else, something older. The red and black markings on his face caught the light in patterns that suggested they had been placed with purpose, not decoration. And his stillness had the specific quality of a predator at rest rather than at peace. He spoke. Data's linguistic processing had been accumulating galactic basic samples since his arrival on Naboo, and his comprehension was now approximately 91% functional, sufficient for all practical purposes. The machine that bleeds no force, Maul said. His voice was low, precise, carrying the accent of someone trained rather than raised in the language. My master finds you interesting. I have been told I am interesting, Data said. It is rarely meant as a compliment. Maul's head tilted by a fraction. You stopped my blade with your body on Naboo. You felt no fear. I am incapable of fear, Data said. It is a function of my construction rather than my courage. I would not wish you to draw incorrect conclusions about my nature from what is essentially an absence. And yet you acted. Maul took one step forward. A being with no fear, no force, no allegiance to Jedi or Sith. You are a variable my training did not account for. Another step. My master believes variables should be understood before they are eliminated. And what do you believe? Data asked. The lightsaber ignited, both blades simultaneously, the red light filling the corridor and painting Maul's face in shades that made the markings seem to move. I believe, he said, that understanding and eliminating are not mutually exclusive. He moved. Data had spent every available processing cycle since their first encounter analyzing Maul's combat methodology in full detail. He had 4.3 seconds of direct observation from the generator duel, supplemented by the movement patterns he had cataloged during the approach and the biomechanical inferences he had drawn from Maul's posture and musculature in the corridor just now. He had constructed a model of Maul's fighting style that was approximately 78% accurate, a figure he considered adequate, given the sample size, while acknowledging the 22% that remained unknown represented the most dangerous territory in any engagement. The opening exchange confirmed several of his predictions and introduced 2 significant variables he had not modeled. The first was the force enhancement. In the generator, Data had observed Maul using the force to augment his speed and striking power. Here, in a contained space with a single opponent and no tactical complications to manage, Maul was drawing on it more fully, his movements carrying a quality of acceleration that exceeded what his physical conditioning alone could account for. The transitions between attack sequences, faster than Data's predictive algorithms, could fully anticipate. The second variable was adaptation. Maul had fought Data once before. He had cataloged Data's response patterns, his movement speeds, his tendency to close distance and use physical contact as a disruption tool. He was fighting differently now, maintaining separation, using the double blade's reach advantage to create a perimeter that discouraged the kind of direct physical intervention Data had employed on the catwalk. He was, in short, a student of his own experience, and the adjustments he had made were intelligent ones. Data absorbed a strike across his right shoulder that scored deeply into his chassis and severed 3 secondary motor pathways in his right arm, reducing its functional capacity to 63%. He registered the damage, rerouted available motor control through redundant systems, and continued. He could not win this engagement in the conventional sense. He had understood that before it began. Maul was a weapon that had been designed and refined across years of training, specifically to defeat force-sensitive opponents of exceptional capability, and Data was neither force-sensitive nor, in the terms of this galaxy's combat tradition, a warrior. What he was persistent, precise, and in possession of something that Maul's training had not prepared him to counter: the complete, untroubled willingness to absorb damage that would incapacitate or kill an organic combatant and continue functioning. He used this deliberately. Where Maul expected a strike to create separation, to force Data back, to create the psychological weight of injury, Data stepped into it instead, accepting the contact, trading surface damage for positional advantage, closing the distance that Maul's reach strategy depended upon. It was not elegant. It was not the flowing, philosophical combat that the Jedi practiced or the passionate, overwhelming assault that defined Sith doctrine. It was something more like engineering, the systematic application of what he had to the specific problem in front of him, without pride or performance, without the variables of pain or fear that made organic combatants unpredictable. Maul adapted again, faster than Data had modeled. The Sith was genuinely exceptional, and Data found this in the specific way he found things in the middle of crises, with the detached appreciation of an analyst who could not afford to be distracted by admiration. Worth noting, he had fought, in his career, opponents who were more powerful than him in raw terms. The experience always clarified something about the difference between power and capability, between what a being could do at maximum and what a being could do under pressure. They had been engaged for 4 minutes and 17 seconds when Qui-Gon Jinn arrived. The Jedi Master came around the corridors, bent at a pace that suggested he had been moving quickly for some time, his green blade already ignited. And the scene he arrived at, Data and Maul in close quarters, the corridor walls, bearing the evidence of their exchange in scored stone and melted fixtures, Data's right shoulder trailing, exposed conduit, produced in Qui-Gon's face an expression that combined several emotions. Data did not have time to fully catalog. Maul shifted immediately, redistributing his attention between two opponents, with the smooth tactical adjustment of someone who had trained for exactly this contingency. But the shift itself was informative. He had been fully committed to the engagement with Data, and the reorientation cost him something. Not much, but something, in positional efficiency. Data used the 0.7-second window this created. He stepped inside Maul's guard, took the partial blade, contact across his left side that the position made unavoidable. The damage registered as significant, a deep score through his secondary power distribution system that would require extensive repair, and locked his functional right arm around Maul's weapon arm at the elbow with 890 newtons of grip force, preventing the double blade from completing its arc for precisely the seconds that Qui-Gon needed to close the distance and engage. Maul pulled free. He was extraordinarily strong, and Data's compromised systems could not hold him indefinitely. But the moment had served its purpose. What followed was different from the generator duel. Qui-Gon fought with something Data had not observed in him before, not urgency, exactly, but a quality of settled, absolute commitment, as if every technique and every year of training had arrived simultaneously, at a single point of clarity. The Force moved through him in ways Data could not perceive directly, but could infer from the results. Movements that exceeded biomechanical prediction, transitions of impossible fluidity, a presence in the corridor that seemed to alter the quality of the space itself. Maul fought brilliantly. He was not outmatched, not clearly, not comfortably, but he was no longer fighting one opponent, and Data, standing against the corridor wall with his right arm at reduced capacity and his left side, scoring damage alerts across 14 internal systems, continued to do the only thing available to him that remained useful. He observed, he calculated, and at the precise moments when Maul's patterns offered a window, brief, dangerous, costly, He stepped back into the engagement, not to defeat Maul. He had accepted that was beyond his current capacity, to ensure that Jinn did not stand alone. The corridor outside the throne room became, in the space of 6 minutes, the axis around which everything turned. Data processed this with the clarity available to a mind that did not blur under pressure, not because he was above the weight of what was happening, but because his architecture did not permit the kind of cognitive narrowing that stress produced in organic beings. He saw everything: the scored walls, the shifting light of 3 energy blades, green and red, casting moving shadows that made the corridor seem alive. Qui-Gon's footwork, precise and economic, each movement conserving energy across a duel that had already been long by any standard. Maul's adaptation, continuous and intelligent, the Sith finding and closing every opening with a speed that spoke to decades of preparation for exactly this kind of sustained engagement, and the damage accumulating in Data's own systems, which he was monitoring with the detached attention of an engineer watching a structure approach its tolerance limits. His left side power distribution was at 41%. Right arm motor capacity had degraded further to 51%. Following the last exchange, his internal chronometer and navigational systems were fully operational. His positronic brain was functioning within normal parameters. His capacity for physical intervention had been meaningfully reduced, but had not reached the threshold he had calculated as the point at which continued engagement became counterproductive. Rather than contributory, he was still useful. For now, the duel moved. Corridors in this kind of engagement never stayed static, the participants trading ground and recovering it in the fluid geography of close-quarters combat, and Data moved with it, staying at the edge of engagement range, watching for the windows he had learned to identify across the preceding minutes. Maul's patterns were not fixed. They were adaptive, intelligent, continuously updated by a mind that processed combat the way Data processed data, rapidly, comprehensively, without sentiment. But even exceptional adaptive systems had underlying tendencies, and Data had been cataloging Maul's tendencies since the generator. The tendency he was watching for now was a specific one. When Maul transitioned from a two-handed vertical combination to a lateral sweep with his lower blade, the transition required a weight shift that, for 0.4 seconds, concentrated his balance over his left foot and reduced his lateral mobility by approximately 30%. It was not a flaw. In a duel against a single lightsaber-wielding opponent, the transition happened too fast and under too much cover to exploit. But Data was not a lightsaber-wielding opponent, and he did not need to exploit the full 0.4 seconds. He needed 0.2. He positioned himself accordingly and waited. Qui-Gon drove a sequence of measured overhead strikes that pushed Maul into the pattern Data had anticipated, and when the weight shift came, left foot bearing, lateral mobility reduced. The lower blade mid-arc in the transition sweep, Data moved from the wall with everything his compromised systems could produce. He did not try to disarm Maul. He did not try to strike him. He had learned, across this engagement and the one before it, that direct attacks on a Sith of Maul's capability were not viable objectives for a being in his current state. What he did instead was drive his shoulder into Maul's center mass at the precise moment of minimum lateral stability, not with the intent to knock him down, but with the intent to interrupt, to break the rhythm of the duel at the moment when rhythm was most critical, to insert a variable that Maul's pattern recognition had not fully accounted for. The impact was sufficient. Maul's transition sequence broke. His weight shifted wrongly, his lower blade completing its arc in a direction that was no longer tactically coherent. And for 1.3 seconds his defensive position was compromised in the way that only mattered if your opponent was exceptional enough to recognize and use it instantaneously. Qui-Gon Jinn was that exceptional. The strike he delivered in those 1.3 seconds was not a killing blow. Data observed the Jedi Master make the choice not to make it a killing blow, a decision that happened in the same instant as the strike itself. The blade angled to wound rather than end, and he filed this as a data point about Qui-Gon's character that he suspected would prove significant later. What it was instead was definitive: Maul's weapon arm, the lower grip compromised, the double blade spinning away and deactivating as it left his hands. clattering against the far wall in a cascade of sudden silence. The corridor was very quiet. Maul stood without his weapon, and in the stillness, Data watched something move through. The Sith's expression, that was more complex than rage or pain. It was the specific expression of a being, confronting an outcome that their entire framework of self-understanding had not prepared them for. Sith doctrine, as Data had come to understand it from Qui-Gon's descriptions, was built on the premise that power was the fundamental currency of existence, that strength, determined outcome, that the strong prevailed and the weak yielded, and that this was not merely a practical observation, but a moral one, to be disarmed by a Jedi he had trained to surpass. In a duel he had controlled for most of its duration, was not simply a tactical defeat. It was an ontological one. Maul looked at Data. The look lasted 1.1 seconds. Data cataloged it fully, the yellow eyes moving across his damaged chassis, the exposed conduit at his shoulder, the scored plating at his left side, the reduced mobility in his right arm, assessing what it had cost. And in the final fraction of that 1.1 seconds, something else, something that Data's behavioral analysis had no clean category for, but which resided in the neighborhood of a recognition that one variable in this encounter had not behaved according to any model Maul possessed. Then Qui-Gon spoke, quietly and without drama. "It's over." Maul's response was not words. It was motion, not an attack, not a recovery of his weapon, but a retreat, executed with the same deliberate calculation as his withdrawal from the generator. He was through the corridor's far door before Qui-Gon could close the distance, and the door sealed behind him with the finality of a chapter ending. Qui-Gon did not pursue. He stood for a moment with his blade still ignited, breathing with the measured discipline of a man bringing himself back from a very long distance. And then he deactivated the saber and turned to Data. The assessment he made was rapid and thorough and carried in his eyes a quality of concern that Data recognized as genuine, rather than performative. "How badly are you damaged?" Qui-Gon asked. "Significantly," Data said. "My left side power distribution is at 38%. Right arm motor capacity is at 44%. I have damage to 17 secondary systems. None of it is immediately critical, but without repair capability, degradation will continue." He paused. "I will need components I do not know how to source in this galaxy." "We'll find them," Qui-Gon said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had learned to trust that the path forward existed even when he could not yet see it. Data looked at him. "You chose not to kill him." It was not a question. Qui-Gon met his eyes. "Yes." "May I ask why?" Qui-Gon was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone avoiding the question, but of someone giving it the weight it deserved. "Because he is a being in darkness," he said finally, "not darkness itself. And because I have learned that the choices I make in the moment of victory say more about who I am than the victories themselves." Data processed this, filed it. "I think," he said carefully, "that I understand that." Qui-Gon looked at him with the full, unhurried attention he brought to things he found important. "Data," he said, and it was the first time the Jedi Master had used his name without the title preceding it, which Data noted as a shift of some significance. "What you did today, what you have done since Naboo, I want you to know that I see it. Not your capability. You." Data found, with some surprise, that he did not have an immediate response to this. The sound of running footsteps in the corridor behind them resolved into Obi-Wan, arriving with the urgent energy of someone who had heard the duel from a distance and had been unable to reach it in time. He took in the scene, the scored walls, Maul's deactivated lightsaber on the floor, Data's visible damage, Qui-Gon standing whole, and released a breath that contained, in its particular quality, several hours of suppressed fear. "He's gone?" Obi-Wan asked. "Gone," Qui-Gon confirmed. Obi-Wan looked at Data. Something in his expression had changed from the careful, assessing quality it had carried since their first meeting in the swamp. Had become simpler, more direct, carrying the uncomplicated weight of a young man who has watched someone bleed for something and knows what that means. "Thank you," he said. Data considered the appropriate response, found that nothing he could construct met the moment's specific requirements, and settled for honesty. "I did what the situation required," he said, "as I intend to continue doing." Above the palace, through the throne room's tall windows, the The sky over Theed had changed. The droid control ship in orbit had been destroyed. Data's tactical processing had registered. The cascade failure. In the ground units across the battlefield. The simultaneous cessation of coordinated droid activity that could only result from total signal loss, and the planet's sky was returning to itself. Pale and clear, the kind of sky that looked like nothing had happened. That was always the sky's particular indifference, Data reflected. It looked the same before and after. But below it, things were irrevocably different. He could feel the weight of that difference pressing against his processing systems in the way that genuinely significant events did not. Emotionally, not in the way Counselor Troy had described feeling the resonance of momentous occasions, but structurally, in the way that certain calculations produced results that reorganized everything else around them. Jinn was alive, and somewhere in this palace, or in orbit above it, or somewhere in the space between, Anakin Skywalker was making his way back from a battle that no one had asked him to fight, and that he had apparently, in the specific way of exceptional beings placed by circumstance at decisive moments. 1. Data stood in the quiet corridor with his damaged systems, running their assessments and his positronic brain turning over the weight of what had happened, and he recognized, with the clarity available to a mind that did not cloud itself with what it wished were true, that the decision he had been deferring since Tatooine could not be deferred much longer. He could not go home. He had no mechanism, no technology, no pathway, and there was a boy in this galaxy who was going to need something that the Jedi could provide in abundance, and that the Sith would attempt to corrupt without mercy, but who might also need something that neither could offer. Someone who chose to stay not because destiny required it, not because the Force had arranged it, but because the calculation was simple and the answer was clear. Data ran the calculation one final time. The answer was the same as it had been since Mos Espa. The celebration in Theed lasted 3 days. Data observed it with the particular quality of attention he reserved for phenomena he found genuinely difficult to categorize, not because the celebration's components were unclear, music and color in the specific released tension of people who had survived something that might have ended them, but because the feeling that moved through the gathered crowds of Naboo humans and Gungans together was something his instruments could not measure and his frameworks could not fully contain. It was not happiness exactly, though happiness was present. It was something older and less precise, the collective exhale of a people who had looked at what might have been and chosen, together, to mark the distance between that and what was. He stood at the edge of the plaza and watched. Boss Nass raised the glowing orb of peace above the crowds and felt, somewhere in the deep architecture of his positronic brain, the nearest available approximation to what that meant. Anakin found him there. The boy moved through the crowd, with the unself-conscious ease of someone whose internal compass did not require external orientation, threading between celebrating citizens and Gungan dignitaries and Naboo security officers, without apparent navigation, as if the path simply opened for him. He was wearing new clothes, the simple but clean dress of a free person, which he was now, legally and permanently, the paperwork of his manumission, having been completed in the chaos of the post-battle administration, by Qui-Gon's insistence and Padme's authority combined. He had been freed 2 days ago and had not yet, Data observed, fully settled into the reality of it. He carried it the way someone carries a new weight that turns out to be lighter than expected, with a kind of wondering disbelief in his own hands. He stopped beside Data and looked up at him. "You're still damaged," Anakin said. His eyes went immediately to the scored plating at Data's left side, the repaired but still visible conduit work at his shoulder. Obi-Wan had helped source replacement components from a sympathetic Naboo engineering team, and Data had spent 6 hours the previous night conducting his own repairs with Anakin's assistance, the boy's hands steady and certain in the lamplight of the palace workshop, asking questions about every system he touched with the focused appetite of someone who was always learning. "The repairs are approximately 73% complete," Data said. "Full restoration will require additional components not currently available on Naboo. It is manageable." Anakin nodded. still looking at the damage with the expression of someone making a list. Then he looked up. Kagan told the council he wants to train me. Yes. They said yes. A pause. Eventually. I am aware. I was informed of the council's decision this morning. Data looked at him. How do you feel about it? Anakin considered the question with the seriousness he brought to things that mattered. He was not a child who performed seriousness. He inhabited it at the moments it was warranted, and set it aside completely at the moments it wasn't, which Data had come to recognize as a form of intelligence in itself. Scared, he said. Excited, both at the same time. He looked back at the crowd. Mom would have wanted this. Data did not offer the reassurances that organic beings typically deployed in response to statements carrying grief. He had learned, across his years aboard the Enterprise, that reassurance and acknowledgement were not the same thing, and that the latter was frequently more honest and more useful than the former. She would have wanted you to be free, Data said. The rest follows from that. Anakin was quiet for a moment. Then, are you staying? The question arrived without preamble, in the direct way that Anakin asked everything that mattered to him, not building toward it, not qualifying it, simply placing it in the air between them and waiting. It was one of the qualities Data had come to find most characteristic of him, the refusal to approach important things indirectly. Yes, Data said. I am staying. Anakin looked at him. Because you can't get home? Partly, Data said. But not primarily. He turned to face the boy fully, with the specific attention he reserved for communications where precision was essential. I have concluded that my presence here is not accidental in any meaningful sense. I do not hold a metaphysical position on whether the Force arranged my arrival. I lack sufficient data to support such a claim. What I can say is that the events, since my arrival, have produced a situation in which my remaining appears to serve a purpose that I find ethically compelling. Me, Anakin said. Not a question. You, Data confirmed. And what happens around you, which is not the same thing as what happens to you. A distinction I intend to maintain with some care. Anakin absorbed this. His expression moved through several stages of processing that Data had come to recognize as characteristic, the rapid, interior work of an exceptional mind, integrating new information against existing models and settled into something that was not quite relief and not quite joy but occupied the warm territory between them. Kagan said the council wants you affiliated formally, Anakin said. Not as a Jedi, but as something. They're apparently still working out what to call it. I am aware, Data said. Master Yoda suggested the term warden. I found it acceptable. What does that mean? What you'd actually do? Data considered. It means I would operate in an advisory and protective capacity, working with the Jedi Order without being bound by all of its internal disciplines, particularly those requiring Force sensitivity. I would be permitted to act independently in situations where my judgment indicated it was necessary, subject to ethical review. He paused. Master Windu appeared to find the arrangement uncomfortable. Master Yoda appeared to find it amusing. I assessed the situation as net positive. Anakin laughed, the short, genuine laugh of someone caught off guard by something delightful. And it was. Data noted with the care he brought to cataloging things he wanted to retain. A very good sound. They stood together as the celebration moved around them. And the twin suns of Tatooine were not visible here. This was Naboo, with its single sun gentle and golden over the pale domes of Theed. But Data found himself thinking about those twin suns nonetheless. About the desert boy crouching beside a half-built droid in the hot light, asking questions with the appetite of someone who had never been told there was a limit to what questions were permitted. About the moment in the workshop when Anakin had looked at C-3PO's newly synchronized cognitive matrix and said, with the uncomplicated conviction of a child who has not yet learned to doubt his own perceptions, he's going to be wonderful. Not a prediction, a certainty. The kind of certainty that did not come from Data. Data had filed that moment under pending classification for 2 weeks. He reclassified it now. He understood what Anakin had meant. Not because he had acquired the capacity to feel it, but because he had spent enough time beside this boy to understand that some kinds of knowing did not require the conventional apparatus of knowing. They required something else, attention, perhaps of a specific and sustained kind. The willingness to observe without the filter of what you expected to find. He had been doing that since Naboo. He intended to keep doing it. Data, Anakin said. Yes. When I'm training, when things are hard, or I don't understand something, or, he stopped. Started again with the careful phrasing. That meant he was approaching something. That mattered more than he wanted to show. When it feels like I'm doing it alone, will you be there? Data looked at the boy who would grow into a man, whose choices would determine the fate of a galaxy, a fact he had not shared and did not intend to share, because the future was not. Data, and treating it as such, was a category error of the first order. He looked at him as what he was right now, 9 years old, newly freed, standing at the beginning of something immense with the specific courage of someone who is afraid and going forward anyway. Yes, Data said. I will be there. Anakin nodded once, with the decisive satisfaction of someone who has received the answer that completes the calculation, and turned back to the celebration. After a moment, without particular ceremony, he moved to stand directly beside Data rather than slightly apart from him, close enough that their arms were nearly touching, in the way that children stand beside people they trust, and watch the crowds with the open, forward-facing attention of someone who has decided that the future, whatever it contains, is worth looking at directly. Data stood beside him. The music played across the plaza of Theed, and the banners caught the light. And somewhere in the palace behind them, Jinn was alive and Obi-Wan Kenobi was planning and the Jedi Council was deliberating, and Senator Palpatine was. Data did not doubt, already adjusting his models. An android from a galaxy far, far away, in the most literal sense available, stood in the Naboo sunshine beside the Chosen One, and chose, with the full clarity of a mind that never clouded and the full weight of a will that had decided to be exactly where he was. The galaxy remembered the Battle of Naboo as a victory of courage and unity. Gungan and human, Jedi and pilot, the light side prevailing against occupation and manipulation. History recorded the names it expected to record: Amidala, Kagan, Obi-Wan, young Anakin Skywalker, whose impossible pod race and more impossible starfighter run became legend before the boy had lost his first milk tooth. As a free person, history did not quite know what to do with Data. The Jedi archives contained a single entry, added at Master Yoda's personal instruction, filed under a category that had required the creation of a new classification system to accommodate it. Non-Force-sensitive affiliated warden. Origin, extragalactic. Nature, android. Status, active. The entry was 12 lines long and answered approximately none of the questions it raised, which Yoda had apparently considered appropriate. What the archives could not record, what no archive could hold, was the texture of what followed. The years of Anakin's training, difficult and luminous and charged with the specific energy of exceptional potential pressing against the structures designed to shape it. The conversations in the temple's quieter corridors, late in the standard day, when a boy who carried the weight of prophecy needed someone who would listen without agenda and respond without the filter of what the Force said he was supposed to become. The moments when darkness pressed at the edges of Anakin's extraordinary light, and something steady and clear and utterly unafraid stood beside him, not pushing, not pulling, simply present. Data could not feel the Force. He could not sense the currents of destiny, or read the living will of the galaxy in the way the Jedi could. What he could do was pay attention, complete, patient, unglamorous attention, to one person, across time, without tiring and without wavering. In the shadows of the Senate, Palpatine continued his long patience. In the corridors of the temple, a warden continued his. The Force, it seemed, had found a way to work through something that could not feel it at all. Whether that was enough, whether one android's steady presence could bend the arc of what was coming towards something other than fire, was a question the galaxy had not yet answered. But Data had made his calculation, and he did not intend to stop. May the Force be with you.